We had driven for what felt like forever, deeper and deeper into the Colorado backcountry. The Forest Service road wound through dense stretches of pine and aspen, the trees occasionally breaking to reveal vast stretches of rugged land. No signs of civilization. No fences, no cabins, no distant farmhouses, just open Bureau of Land Management, BLM, land as far as the eye could see. That was exactly what we wanted. Car camping this far out meant absolute solitude. No other campers, no noise except the wind through the trees, and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the brush. We were miles from the nearest town, at least an hour and a half down a dirt road that didn't see much traffic. The ground was dry, the air crisp with the sharp scent of pine, and the sun was just starting to drop low in the sky when we pulled into a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees. We had 3 cars with us, packed with everything we needed for a long weekend away. 8 of us in total, 3 guys, 5 girls. This wasn't our first time camping together, and we knew the drill. We picked a good spot where we could set up our tents and fire pit, about 30 yards from where we parked the cars in a loose triangle. No cell service, which wasn't a surprise. It didn't bother us. That was the whole point of being out here, to disconnect. We spent the evening the way we always did. Set up camp, gathered firewood, cooked a big meal over the flames. The light slowly drained from the sky, turning the treetops gold before everything faded into deep blue. The fire crackled, and the temperature dropped fast, like it always does in the mountains. A couple of us had brought drinks, but nobody was drunk. Just full, tired, and ready to crash. There was no sign that anything was wrong. It wasn't until we went back to the cars to grab some last-minute stuff before bed that we saw it. The first person to notice was ahead of me, his flashlight beam sweeping over the gravel. He stopped so suddenly I almost walked right into him. What the hell? I heard it before I saw it, the unmistakable hiss of a deflating tire. Then I saw the slashes. Every single car, all 3 of them. The front right tire on each one had a deep, clean gash in the sidewall, like someone had taken a box cutter and dragged it straight through the rubber. For a split second, we all stood there staring. I think our brains were trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe one of the guys had done it as some kind of sick prank. Then reality set in. This wasn't a joke. Someone had done this, and we hadn't heard a damn thing. The fire was still flickering behind us, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. The trees stood tall and silent, watching. The dirt road stretched away in both directions, empty. If someone had driven up, we would have heard them. If they had walked, we would have seen their flashlights in the dark. That meant they had been here. Hiding. Watching. My stomach felt like ice. Panic hit fast. Nobody said anything at first, just the sound of breathing, of people stepping backward instinctively like it would help. Then we started moving, fast. One guy had a gun, and he pulled it out immediately, scanning the tree line. I didn't even think to be afraid of that at the time. It felt necessary. Someone had been close enough to kneel next to each of our cars and do this, and we hadn't noticed. That meant they could still be here. I kept turning in circles, looking into the woods, trying to catch movement. Nothing. Just deep, endless black between the trees. But I could feel it. That horrible, crawling feeling on the back of my neck. We were being watched. I was sure of it. I don't remember anyone talking much. Just a lot of frantic motion. We checked every car, same exact cut, front right tire, sidewall, no question it was deliberate. We had spares, but only one per car. That meant every single one of us had to be out in the open, changing tires, while somebody, or multiple somebodies, was out there in the trees watching. The guy with the gun kept watch while the rest of us worked. My hands were shaking so bad it was hard to get the lug nuts off. The night was deadly quiet except for the occasional thud of a tire hitting the ground and the wind shifting through the trees. I kept snapping my head up, looking into the woods, convinced I would see a figure standing there. I never did. Every sound made me jump. The scrape of a jack handle, the crunch of gravel under someone's foot, the wind moving a branch, it all felt wrong. I had never been so aware of how alone we were. It didn't take long, but it felt like hours. The whole time, the gun was up, scanning the woods. Then we were in the cars, slamming doors, starting engines. Headlights swept across the trees as we turned around in the clearing, dirt kicking up behind us. Nobody said a word until we hit pavement. I don't remember the exact moment the feeling went away, but I do remember taking a deep breath for what felt like the first time in hours. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so hard. We stopped at the first gas station we found. all three cars pulling in together under the harsh fluorescent lights. We called the cops and the Forest Service, gave them our location, told them what happened. But what could they do? Whoever did it was long gone. The cops told us it was a good thing we were armed, that we should always be careful camping that far out. That was it. We never found out who did it. Never found footprints, never saw headlights in the distance, never heard another car on the road. Just slashed tires done in silence by someone or multiple people who never intended to be seen. I still think about it sometimes, about how vulnerable we were, how much worse it could have been. Someone was out there that night, and they were watching us. Something about it felt right. The quiet of the woods, the way the trees swallowed up the sound of the town behind me, the way my footsteps crunched against the dirt and dead leaves. It made me feel separate from everything, like I was stepping into a world that belonged only to me. I had been hiking the same patch of woods for years, ever since I was a teenager. The town I lived in was surrounded by them, thick and sprawling, with a dozen unofficial trails that weaved through the trees. Some led to old, forgotten structures, crumbling stone foundations from houses that had long since disappeared, rusted-out cars overtaken by vines. Others led to nowhere, just miles of trees and dense undergrowth. I liked the challenge of it, the feeling of pushing farther and farther in, seeing how much of the forest I could commit to memory before it all started to look the same. Sometimes I went so deep that I stayed out past midnight. That never bothered me. I had always been comfortable in the dark. Until the night I found the shanty town. I had started my hike late that evening. I had done this enough times to know what to expect. The woods got darker, the air cooled, the animals got quieter. I had a good flashlight, but I kept it off unless I absolutely needed it. I liked letting my eyes adjust to the dark, letting the moon guide me when it was bright enough. There was something about walking through the woods at night that made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. But that night felt different, even before I found it. I couldn't put my finger on why at first. Nothing obvious had changed. The trees were the same, the paths the same, but something was off. There was an absence of sound that I didn't like. Normally, even late at night, the woods had noise, branches shifting, distant rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. But now there was nothing. Just my own footsteps, too loud in the silence. I kept going, pushing deeper into the trees, further than I usually went. Then I smelled the smoke. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. A distant, bitter scent in the air. I hesitated, then kept walking. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The woods weren't part of a campground, and I had never seen another person on these trails, not once in all my years hiking here. But the smell of burning wood was unmistakable. I pressed forward, moving slower now, more cautious. The trees thinned slightly, and that's when I saw it. A small clearing. Low structures scattered throughout, thrown together from sheets of scrap metal, pieces of plywood, tarps, and old bed sheets. Half a dozen of them at least, barely big enough to crawl inside. At the center of the clearing was a fire pit, a ring of old bricks surrounding a smoldering fire inside of a burned-out tire. And no people. The whole setup looked like it had been made in a hurry. The structures were crude, barely holding together, with gaps big enough to see inside. Some had old blankets inside, others had nothing but dirt. But there was no sign of anyone. No movement, no voices, no figures sitting near the fire. No rustling from inside the shelters. Just the fire, still burning, unattended. Something about it made my stomach tighten. The woods were dense here, the sky barely visible through the trees, but the fire cast long shadows across the ground, flickering and moving as if someone was standing just out of sight. I stood at the edge of the clearing, listening. Nothing. My first thought was that I had stumbled onto a homeless encampment. But why would they leave the fire going? Why abandon their shelters with everything inside? There were objects scattered around, plastic bottles, a few metal pots, old clothes folded neatly on a tree stump. Nothing valuable, but things people would take with them if they were leaving for good. I waited, heart pounding. Listened for anything, any sound at all. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how completely abandoned it felt. Not just empty, left behind. The fire popped, sending up a brief shower of embers. I took a cautious step forward. I didn't want to, but something in me needed to understand. Needed to see up close. The first shelter I passed had a blue tarp for a roof. There was an old pillow inside, stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. a plastic bag beside it, half full of empty food wrappers. The second shelter had more in it. A few cheap metal utensils on the ground, a book with half the pages missing, a shoe without laces. Still no people. I circled the fire pit. The burned-out tire smelled awful, the rubber melting into the dirt, black streaks running down the bricks. I kicked at the embers lightly, half expecting someone to suddenly appear from the trees. No one did. The silence felt suffocating. The clearing wasn't big, but it felt like it stretched forever, like I had stepped into a space that shouldn't exist. And then I noticed something. Footprints in the dirt. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the ground between shelters, pressing deep into the soft earth. Some fresh, others older. But none of them led away from the clearing. Just around it, like people had been here. Moving, walking, pacing. And then they had vanished. I stepped back, my skin crawling. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave. I turned, moving fast now, retracing my steps, heading straight back the way I came. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, pressing against my back, making me resist the urge to break into a run. I didn't look behind me. I walked for what felt like forever, only stopping when I was far enough away that the smell of smoke was gone. Only then did I turn my flashlight on, the beam cutting harshly through the trees. I followed the trail, moving faster than I ever had before, ignoring the burning in my legs, the tightness in my chest. I didn't stop until I saw the first signs of town, the distant glow of streetlights just beyond the tree line. When I finally stepped onto pavement, my breath came in ragged gasps. The world felt different. Too bright, too loud, too real after the crushing silence of the woods. I told myself it had just been an abandoned camp, that maybe whoever had been staying there had left in a hurry, leaving the fire burning, that the footprints had just been coincidence, not something meant to trap me in that clearing. But even now, I can't make sense of it. That place wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. There was nothing unusual about that night. The air was cool, but not cold, and the full moon was so bright it cast shadows through the trees. It was the kind of night that made the world feel smaller, like everything had been compressed into a softer version of itself. The roads were empty, the wind barely stirred the leaves, and the sky was so clear that the stars looked painted on. I was 20, maybe 21, in college in the North Georgia mountains. I had spent years getting familiar with the woods around my campus, exploring trails at night with my friends, letting the quiet settle into me until it felt like home. That night, I was feeling restless. The idea of sitting in my dorm room, doing nothing, felt unbearable. So, I decided to go for a night hike. Alone. It wasn't a big deal. I had done it before plenty of times. The trail I picked was easy, only about a mile long, mostly flat, and looping back to where it started. It wasn't a park or a tourist trail, just a stretch of land in a quiet, rural area where the trees grew thick and tangled. There were no signs, no benches, no trash cans. Just dirt paths and the occasional hunting blind nailed into a tree. I was a little high. Not so much that I was out of it, but just enough that everything felt sharper, more interesting. The moonlight made the entire forest glow with a pale blue haze, and I realized after a few minutes that I didn't even need my flashlight. I left it off. The first part of the hike was incredible, peaceful. I moved quietly, stepping carefully to keep my footsteps soft. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, like the whole world was pausing just for me. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of small animals and the distant hoot of an owl. I don't know when that feeling changed. There was no sudden shift, no snap of a branch or gust of wind that made me look over my shoulder. 1 second, I was enjoying myself, lost in the rhythm of walking, and the next, I was uneasy. It was like a slow tightening in my chest, a quiet voice in the back of my head telling me something was wrong. I stopped walking. I listened. Silence. Not just quiet, the total absence of sound. No insects chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. Then I heard it. A man's voice. Crying. It came from ahead of me, somewhere off to the right of the trail. Faint, but unmistakable. I went still, every muscle in my body tensing. He was sobbing. Deep, racking sobs, the kind you hear from people who have lost something they can't replace. But under the crying, there was something else, a kind of gibbering, almost like he was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come out right. It was broken stammering, almost childlike. I should have turned around right then. But I hesitated. The part of me that wanted to help, the part of me that had been raised to be kind, to do the right thing, was fighting with something much older, much more instinctive. My brain was telling me that he might be hurt, that he might need help, but my body was telling me to leave. The feeling in my gut was sick, cold, like the moment you realize you've made a terrible mistake, but it's already too late to fix it. I wanted to call out to him, to ask if he was okay, but my throat wouldn't work. My body refused. I didn't move. The crying went on. Deep, horrible sobs, rising and falling like waves. And then I realized something that made my skin go cold. It wasn't changing. It wasn't getting louder or quieter. It wasn't shifting position. It was the exact same sound, over and over again, like a recording on a loop. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to leave. I turned slowly, as quietly as I could, and started walking back the way I had come. My steps were deliberate, my breaths shallow. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look into the trees. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to make a sound. The crying continued behind me, exactly the same. I walked faster. The urge to run was overwhelming, but I knew better. Running makes noise. Running draws attention. I focused on each step, each breath, every tiny movement of my body. The crying didn't stop. I kept expecting it to change, to get closer, to turn into a scream, to break into laughter, to do something. But it just kept going, the same horrible, stammering sobs, like a man trapped in a single moment of grief. I felt the trees closing in around me, the darkness pressing against my back. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustling leaf a threat. My hands were shaking. My chest was tight. I kept walking. And then finally, the sound started to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like I was stepping away from a speaker. The crying grew softer, more distant, until eventually, I couldn't hear it anymore. But I didn't stop. I walked all the way back to my car, not slowing down, not looking back. I half expected to hear footsteps behind me, or to see a figure moving in the trees, but there was nothing. Just silence. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My body was buzzing with adrenaline, my skin cold with sweat. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I started the engine and drove back to campus. The whole time, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing on the side of the road, watching me leave. But I never saw anything. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know if they were dangerous, if they were sick, if they were lost. But I do know that I was in danger. The feeling I had, that deep, gut-wrenching certainty that I had to leave, wasn't paranoia. It wasn't the weed. It was something older, something instinctive. The kind of fear that kept our ancestors alive. And I have never once regretted listening to it. I never went night hiking alone again. I have always been a night person. Even when I was little, I had trouble falling asleep at a normal time. It wasn't that I had nightmares or anything. I just couldn't shut my brain off when the rest of the world went quiet. As I got older, it only got worse. By the time I was 15, it was just a part of my life. I was used to staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning, staring at my ceiling, waiting for sleep that never came. So I started walking. It wasn't a big deal at first. I lived in a small town, one of those places where nothing ever really happens. The crime rate was low, most of the people were old or had families, and there were only a few main streets. The idea of something bad happening just didn't seem real. So when I started going for walks late at night, I never really worried about it. It became a habit. I'd leave my house around 1:30 or 2 a.m., wander around for an hour or so, and then head back. It helped clear my head. The streets were empty, the world felt different. There was something peaceful about it. But one night, that changed. It started like any other. I left my house at 1:30 a.m., wearing my hoodie, hands stuffed in my pockets. The air was cold, but not freezing. The streets were quiet. I passed by the same houses I always did, cut through the same parking lots, walked the same route I had taken 100 times before. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to head back home. I turned down a side street, moving at my usual pace, when I saw a black van drive past me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was just a car. But a few minutes later, I saw it again. This time, it was moving slower. Not stopping, not pulling over, just drifting down the street at a crawl. I still wasn't sure if it was the same van, but something about it put me on edge. It didn't have its headlights on, just the dim glow of its parking lights. I glanced at it as it passed, but the windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see anything inside. I picked up my pace. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then 10 minutes later, I saw it again. And this time I knew for sure, because it didn't have license plates. Now, I was scared. I wasn't an idiot. I knew that wasn't normal. I had walked these streets enough times to know that this wasn't just some lost driver circling the block. Someone was watching me. I started walking faster, keeping my eyes on the sidewalk ahead of me. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Running would only make noise. If they hadn't decided to act yet, I wasn't going to give them a reason. But then the van turned the corner in front of me and stopped, right in the middle of the road. It was just sitting there, engine rumbling softly, blocking my path. I stopped walking. For a second, my brain shut down. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the van, feeling my pulse hammering in my throat. Then the driver's side door opened. I didn't wait to see who was inside. I turned around and ran. I sprinted down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my feet slamming against the pavement. I didn't know if they were chasing me. I didn't look back. I just ran. I cut down a side street, turned onto another road, then another. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. But then I heard it. The low, steady hum of an engine behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. The van was still following me. I tore through someone's yard, jumped a low fence, and landed hard in the grass. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were about to explode, but I didn't stop. I sprinted through backyards, hopped over another fence, then ducked down behind a shed. I crouched there, trying to quiet my breathing. My chest was heaving, sweat dripping down my face. I peeked out from behind the shed. The van was creeping down the street, moving slow, its tires rolling over the pavement like it had all the time in the world. I ducked back behind the shed, my hands clenched into fists. I stayed there for what felt like forever. Minutes passed, then more. I didn't hear anything. No doors opening, no footsteps, nothing. Eventually, I peeked out again. The van was gone. I stayed behind that shed for another 20 minutes, just in case. My whole body was shaking, but I forced myself to stay still, listening for any sound, any sign that they were still looking for me. But the streets were empty. I got up slowly, heart still hammering, and took the longest way home I could think of. I stuck to backyards, avoiding the main roads, moving as quietly as I could. By the time I reached my house, my entire body felt numb. I climbed in through my bedroom window, locked it, then collapsed onto the floor, still gasping for breath. I never saw the van again, but I never walked at night alone again either. I don't know who was in that van. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. If I had kept walking toward that van instead of running, I don't think I would have made it home that night. There's something about the woods that changes when the sun starts to set. During the day, the redwood forests around UC Santa Cruz are beautiful. Towering trees, golden light filtering through the branches, the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The trails are peaceful, winding deep into the forest, away from the noise of the campus. That's why I liked running there. It felt like stepping into another world, one where I could forget about exams, stress, and everything else for a little while. I had a usual route. It was about 6 miles round trip, a long loop through one of the more isolated trails. I liked that it was quiet. Most students stuck to the main paths or the roads around campus, but I preferred the solitude. It gave me space to think, to clear my head. That day, I had left later than usual. The sun was already dipping lower in the sky when I started. I knew I was cutting it close, but I told myself it would be fine. I'd done this run 100 times before. Even if it got dark near the end, I knew the trail well enough to find my way back. About 15 minutes in, the trees started closing in, the canopy growing thicker. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No distant sounds of students, no cars, just the crunch of my footsteps on the dirt and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. That's when I saw him. Up ahead, walking along the trail, was a man. His clothes were ragged, baggy pants, an oversized jacket that looked dirty and torn. His posture was strange, slightly hunched, his movements slow. His head was tilted downward, like he was focused on the ground in front of him. I was used to seeing people in the woods. Santa Cruz had its fair share of homeless people, and I had heard stories about some of them living in the forest. But something about this guy felt off. He wasn't heading back toward campus. He was walking deeper into the woods. There weren't any other trails that split off in that direction. The path stretched for miles before reaching a road on the other side of the forest. If he kept going that way, he'd be spending the night out there. I told myself it wasn't my business. I wasn't going to stop running just because of one weird guy. As long as I kept my distance, I'd be fine. As I passed him, he spoke. His voice was rough, cracked, like he hadn't used it in a while. What came first, light or sound? I almost stopped. The question caught me so off guard that for a second, I didn't know if I had heard him correctly. I kept running. I don't know why I answered, but I did. Without looking back, I said, light. For a moment, there was silence. Then, just as I was almost out of earshot, I heard him mutter, "Well, I think it's sound. But who knows?" His voice trailed off into mumbling. I picked up my pace. I told myself he was just some harmless, crazy guy talking nonsense. But there was something about his voice that stuck with me. Like he wasn't just saying random words. Like he was waiting for an answer. The sun was lower now, the light dimming. I reached my usual checkpoint, a clearing with a fallen tree I always used as a turnaround point. I stopped for a second, caught my breath, then turned back. And suddenly, I didn't want to go that way. I was going to have to pass him again. It was fully dark now. The trees blocked what little light was left. The shadows between them stretched longer, the spaces between the trunks growing black and endless. The air felt colder. I kept running. As I neared the spot where I had passed him, I slowed. My ears strained for any sound, any movement. But he was gone. I scanned the trail ahead. There was no sign of him. There weren't any other paths he could have taken. If he had turned back toward campus, I would have seen him. That meant he had gone off the trail. I felt exposed. I didn't like that I couldn't see him, but he could see me. Then, somewhere up on the hillside, I heard movement. A sharp, rustling sound. A branch snapping. I turned toward the noise, heart hammering. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense. I couldn't see anything. Then a voice, a different voice, shouted down to me. "Stop." It was a girl's voice. I froze. I squinted up the hill, trying to see through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement. A figure climbing down, struggling against the steep incline. She reached the bottom and stood there, breathing hard. Her clothes were dirty, her leggings torn at the knee. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. She was shaking. She told me she had been running when a man started following her. He didn't just follow, he chased her. When she tried to lose him, he kept coming. When she left the trail, he left the trail. She ran up the hill, scrambling through the trees, trying to get somewhere he couldn't reach. And she had been waiting there, hiding, because she was too afraid to come back down. She didn't know where he went. I felt sick. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. We both knew we needed to get out of there. We ran. Not a jog. Not a steady pace. A full sprint. Every shadow, every rustling leaf, every sound made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, to hear heavy breathing too close, to see movement in the trees. But nothing came. We didn't stop until we hit the road. The streetlights felt unreal after so much darkness. The glow painted the pavement in gold, harsh and artificial. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. She turned to me, whispered a thank you, then hurried off toward campus. I stood there for a long time. I didn't run on that trail again. I don't know who he was. I don't know if he was just some unhinged guy, or if he had been waiting out there for someone like her. Maybe for me. I just know that if she hadn't been up on that hill, if she hadn't warned me to stop, I might have kept running right into whatever was waiting in those trees. The city at night had a certain quietness that I liked. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in the countryside, but a different kind, softer, muted, like the whole place was holding its breath. The distant hum of cars on the highway, the occasional horn, the rustling of leaves when the wind blew through the empty streets. It was peaceful in its own way. I liked walking at this time, especially after a long night. The air was cool, the streets were empty, and everything felt still. I had just left a party, one of those gatherings where the music is loud, the drinks are endless, and the people are all half lost in their own worlds. It had been fun, but I wasn't the type to stay out all night. The buzz of conversation and music had started to feel too much, and I'd needed some air. I decided to walk home instead of calling a ride. It wasn't far, maybe 30 minutes on foot. I'd done it plenty of times before. The streets were mostly well lit, and I knew my way around. At first, I wasn't paying attention to much, just enjoying the quiet, letting my mind wander. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, stretching out ahead of me as I walked. A few storefronts had their security lights on, glowing dimly behind metal grates. Every now and then, I'd pass a building where a single apartment window was still lit, someone inside awake at this late hour. It was maybe 10 minutes into my walk when I first noticed him. A man a block behind me. At first, it didn't mean anything. Just someone else walking home, same as me. But something about it felt off. He wasn't just walking. He was keeping pace. Not fast, not slow, just steady, matching my steps. I brushed it off. It was a city. People walked at night. I kept going. 2 blocks later, I glanced back again. He was closer now. That was when I felt it. That gut feeling. The one that tells you something isn't right. I decided to cross the street. No big deal, just changing my route. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps crossing too. I walked a little faster. So did he. That was it. That was all I needed. My body tensed up. My heart picked up speed. I wasn't panicking. Not yet, but I was on high alert. This was real. This was happening. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't want to start running. Not yet. Running could trigger something. Running could make him chase. I scanned ahead, looking for someone, anyone. The street was mostly empty. Storefronts closed, apartments dark. Then I saw them. Maybe 2 or 3 blocks ahead. A figure was pushing a shopping cart. A homeless person. I had no idea if they were a man or a woman, young or old, dangerous or harmless. But right now they were another human being, and that was all I needed. I picked up my pace, moving toward them. The man behind me did the same. I was close now, just a few feet away from the shopping cart. I didn't hesitate. I called out. Loud. Clear. The person stopped, turning toward me. The streetlight caught their face, a black woman, elderly, worn down by the years. I didn't stop moving. I reached her, standing just beside her, breathing hard, my body tense. Then I turned. The man behind me had slowed. He was standing just beyond the edge of the light now, like he wasn't sure what to do. That's when she pulled it out. A knife. Not just any knife, a big knife. She held it up so he could see it, the blade catching the light. That was all it took. The man hesitated. Then he turned. Then he was gone. Just like that. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, watching him disappear down the street. I exhaled. The woman was looking at me now, eyes sharp, studying me. I hadn't even thought. I had just acted. I'd run up to a stranger in the middle of the night, trusted that they would help me, trusted that they weren't worse than the person following me. And somehow it had worked. We started walking together. For the next few blocks, we didn't say much at first. Just walked. Then slowly we talked. About the city. About the night. About how people saw each other. Assumptions, fears, survival. She told me she'd been on these streets a long time. Seen all kinds of things. I told her I was just walking home. Eventually, we reached a point where our paths split. I stopped. So did she. I turned to her, unsure what to say. Thank you felt too small. But it was all I had. She nodded. Then she turned, pushing her cart, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment, watching her go. Then I walked home. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her. And I never forgot what could have happened that night if she hadn't been there. I still walked the city at night sometimes, but I never walked home alone again. The idea had seemed like a good one at the time. A meteor shower was supposed to light up the sky that night, and what better way to watch it than from the top of the small mountain near our town? It wasn't even a real mountain, more like a tall hill with a well-worn trail leading up to the summit. We'd hiked it plenty of times before, usually during the day, but this time we thought it would be cool to do it at night. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend, and 2 others. We were all 16, still at that stage in life where everything felt like an adventure. Night hikes, breaking little rules, pushing boundaries, it made things exciting. One of our friends, the only girl in the group, had been a little hesitant about going, but we convinced her. We weren't doing anything wrong, just hiking to see the meteor shower. We piled into my friend's old car and drove out to the trailhead. The area was just outside of town, a spot that was popular for hiking and biking during the day, but pretty much deserted at night. There was a small parking lot at the base of the trail, empty except for a single car parked off to the side. We got out, grabbed our backpacks, and started walking. The night was cool, but not cold, and the air smelled like dirt and pine needles. The trail was familiar, winding up through the trees in a series of switchbacks before opening up near the top. There was no real danger here, no cliffs, no wildlife to worry about, just a steady incline and a well-worn path. We were about halfway up when we stopped for a break. That's when we noticed him. A man, a little ways down the trail, walking toward us. At first, we didn't think much of it. People hiked at night sometimes. But as he got closer, we could see him better. He was wearing a suit, not just a jacket over casual clothes. A full suit, dark-colored, buttoned up, stiff-looking. He walked with purpose, steady, not hesitating. We exchanged looks. It was weird. People hiked in all kinds of gear, running clothes, outdoor gear, even casual stuff. But a suit? On a dirt trail in the middle of the night? It made no sense. We didn't say anything, just picked up our pace and kept going. Every few minutes, one of us would glance back. He was still there. Not running, not slowing down, just walking. By the time we stopped again, he was close. Maybe 10 feet away. Too close. We hesitated, unsure what to do. Maybe he'd just walked past us. Maybe he was just some strange guy who had a reason for being here. He didn't walk past us. He stopped. He stood there for a moment, then asked if we were there for the meteor shower. His voice was calm, normal, like it wasn't strange at all that he was out here in a suit at night, following 4 teenagers up a mountain. Then he asked if he could walk with us. None of us knew what to say. It felt like a no-win situation. If we said no, it might piss him off. If we said yes, we'd have to keep walking with him. So we just kept walking, and he walked with us. That was when things got worse. At first, it was just the uncomfortable feeling of having him there. He wasn't doing anything outright threatening, but the whole situation felt wrong. Then we noticed the way he was walking. Not with us, too close to our friend, the girl in our group. He wasn't right next to her, but he was just close enough to make it weird. Close enough that if she stopped suddenly, he'd bump into her. Close enough that she couldn't move without him being right there. It was like he was trying to get as close as possible without making it obvious. The smell of his cologne was strong. Too strong. Like the kind older men wore. We all felt it. The tension. The wrongness of it. None of us spoke. But we didn't need to. We all knew what was happening. When we got to the top, we sat down. We had planned to spread out, relax, watch the sky. But when we sat down, he sat right next to her. Too close. The rest of us were a few feet away, but he was practically touching her. We saw the look on her face. She was scared. We had to do something. I made up an excuse. Something about needing to leave early. It didn't matter what I said. We just needed to go. We stood up, and so did he. We started walking down. So did he. It was different now. Faster. Tenser. None of us spoke. We just moved. Then we ran. We didn't plan it, didn't even look at each other first. It just happened. 1 second we were walking, the next we were sprinting. All 4 of us. Racing down the trail, pushing branches out of the way, nearly tripping over loose dirt. We could hear each other breathing, footsteps slamming against the ground. But that wasn't what scared me. It was the sound behind us. The sound of him running too. Not just running, sprinting. We reached the bottom. We saw the car. We tore the doors open and threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors, locking them. For a second, everything was chaos. Then, through the windshield, him, coming down the trail, full speed. Something in his hand. A stick. No, a branch. A big one. He wasn't just running. He was coming straight for us. The engine roared. The tires skidded on the gravel as we peeled out of the parking lot. I turned in my seat. He was standing at the edge of the lot now, watching us go. We didn't slow down. We didn't stop. We didn't breathe until we were miles away. At some point, we started laughing. Not because it was funny, because we were alive, because we had gotten away. We told ourselves he was just some guy on drugs, some weirdo, just a freak encounter. Then, 2 days later, the news report. A man had strangled his wife, then killed a girl later that night, on a hiking trail. Our trail. Him. The same man. We never told our parents. We never went back. And we never forgot. There was something off about that place. I didn't feel it at first. When we arrived, it was just another camping trip, like so many I had taken with my dad over the years. We'd been to dozens of remote spots before, the kind where you don't see another person for miles. That was the appeal. We both loved the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely cut off from everything except the woods, the water, and whatever was out there with us. But looking back on it now, something was different about that trip. It was summer, warm but not too hot, and the days were long enough that you could hike well into the evening and still make it back before dark. The campground was primitive, just a few cleared spots for tents and a fire ring. No running water, no facilities. It sat next to a lake, one of those deep, still lakes that looked black no matter how clear the water actually was. We set up camp early in the afternoon, pitched the tent, gathered firewood. The plan was simple: set up, explore, cook dinner, and relax by the fire until we were too tired to stay awake. It was supposed to be easy. The hike was something we hadn't planned. It just kind of happened. There was a rough, unmarked trail that followed the shoreline of the lake. It wasn't an official trail, more of a path worn down by years of people walking through the woods. We decided to follow it, just to see where it went. My dad had heard from someone that there was a waterfall further down, and that was enough reason to go. The forest was thick, old-growth trees stretching high above us, their canopies filtering out most of the sunlight. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, the way deep woods always do. The trail wasn't easy. Roots snaked across the dirt, fallen branches forced us to step over or duck under, and every so often, we had to push through thick brush where the path narrowed. It was quiet. That was something I noticed early on. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no insects buzzing. Just the sound of our boots crunching against dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves when we brushed against them. About 15 minutes in, we saw the first thing that felt wrong. A slash pile. For anyone who doesn't know, a slash pile is a heap of dead branches and logs, usually left behind by loggers or forest maintenance crews. This one looked old, the wood dry and gray from years of exposure. It wasn't particularly strange on its own, but right on top of it was a shoe. A kid's shoe. Small, faded pink, the kind with Velcro straps. It sat right there on the highest branch, like someone had placed it there deliberately. We stopped, looked at it. My dad picked it up, turned it over in his hands. It was weathered, but not as much as it should have been. It hadn't been out here for years, maybe months at most. There was no other sign of anything. No footprints, no pieces of clothing, just the shoe, sitting on that pile of dead branches. We didn't say anything about it, just kept walking. The trail got rougher as we went. The trees were dense, pressing in close on either side, and the further we got from camp, the more it felt like we weren't supposed to be there. We reached a small clearing and stopped for a break. My dad needed to take a leak, so he turned one way, and I turned the other to give him some privacy. And that's when we both heard it. A child's voice. "I'm over here." Clear as day. Right there in the trees. My dad thought it was me. I thought it was him. We turned to look at each other at the same time. The silence that followed was crushing. Neither of us moved for what felt like a long time. Then, without speaking, we started searching. We called out, walked through the trees, looking for any sign of someone, a lost kid, another hiker, anyone. Nothing. We spent half an hour looking. There was no one. Eventually, we gave up. We weren't comfortable anymore. The excitement of seeing the waterfall had drained out of us. The woods didn't feel right, the silence too deep, the shadows too long. We turned back. That's when we knew we weren't alone. The sound started as soon as we left the clearing. Twigs snapping, bushes rustling, footsteps, real, heavy footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind. Something was following us. We didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it. We just walked faster. But the faster we walked, the closer the sounds got. It wasn't just one thing. It was multiple. Footsteps on either side of the trail, in the trees behind us. Never too close. Never visible. Just there. We walked faster. Then we walked even faster. The sounds kept pace. I started to feel it then. The real gut deep fear. The kind you can't reason with. The kind that makes your hands shake even when you tell yourself everything is fine. We weren't running. Not yet. But we were close. Then my dad stopped. Just for a second. And I saw his face. He was scared. I had never seen him scared before. We started running. Branches whipped against my arms, my legs. I wasn't thinking about falling. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting back to camp. The sounds kept up. Footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. Snapping twigs. The sound of something big moving fast. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. We burst out of the trees, stumbling into camp, into the clearing where our tent was. Silence. The woods behind us were dead silent. Whatever had been following us stopped the second we left the trees. We stood there, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. Not a single sound. We didn't stay the night. We didn't even pack up properly. We threw everything into the truck as fast as we could, tossing gear, collapsing the tent without folding it. 15 minutes later, we were gone. We never talked about it, never told anyone, and we never went back. I shouldn't have gone alone. That was my first mistake. It wasn't supposed to be a long hike, just a quick evening walk to clear my head. I had been out in the mountains for a few days, camping by myself, trying to get away from everything for a little while. I had always felt comfortable alone in the woods. I grew up hiking, camping, and hunting. I knew how to read a map, how to navigate, how to handle myself if something went wrong. But I made a mistake that night, and it nearly cost me everything. It started around sunset. I had been sitting at my campsite, finishing a simple dinner, when I decided to take a short hike before it got too dark. There was a ridge nearby, one that looked like it would have a great view of the valley below. I figured I could make it up and back in less than an hour. I didn't take much with me. Just a flashlight, my knife, and my phone. No map, no extra layers, no food or water. That was my second mistake. The trail started off easy. It was well-worn, cutting through thick trees, the ground soft with pine needles. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of a bird. I walked quickly, trying to make it to the top before the sun disappeared completely. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky was deep orange, fading into purple. I stood there for a while, taking it in, watching as the last bit of light slipped behind the mountains. And then I turned to go back. I thought I was following the same trail. I was sure of it, but after about 10 minutes, something felt off. The trees looked different. The path seemed narrower, less traveled. I kept walking, telling myself I'd recognize something soon. Then I checked my phone. No service. That was expected. I had barely any signal at camp, and I was even further into the wilderness now. I turned on my flashlight. The trees cast long, twisting shadows across the ground, making everything feel unfamiliar. The deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. I was lost. I stopped, took a deep breath. I had been in situations like this before. The worst thing you can do when you're lost is panic. I told myself I just needed to retrace my steps, find a landmark, look for the ridge. But the more I walked, the worse it got. The trees all looked the same. The ground sloped in ways I didn't recognize. I should have been heading downhill, back toward my campsite, but it felt like I was going deeper into the forest instead. And then I saw something ahead of me, a flash of white. Just for a second, I stopped cold. It was far off between the trees, barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight. A pale shape, a figure. My first thought was that it was another hiker, someone else who had gotten lost. But something about it felt wrong. They weren't moving, just standing there. I called out, but my voice caught in my throat before I could say anything. Some instinct, some deep, primal part of my brain told me not to. I took a step back, and the figure moved. Not toward me, just a small shift, like they were adjusting their stance. Their body was too rigid, too still. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of something human-shaped, wearing white. I turned off my flashlight. I don't know why. It was stupid. But some part of me thought if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. I stood there in the darkness, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. No movement. No footsteps. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I turned the flashlight back on. They were closer, maybe 20 feet away now. Still not moving. Still watching. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches slapped against my arms, my legs. I stumbled over roots, nearly fell more than once. I kept my flashlight pointed down, watching the ground, too afraid to look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I couldn't go any further. And then I stopped. Listened. Silence. I was alone. but I had no idea where I was. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The forest was darker now, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I tried to slow my breathing, to think clearly. If I could just figure out which way was downhill, I could find my way back to camp. I turned, and my flashlight flickered. For half a second, the light dimmed, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw them again. Closer than before. Too close. I didn't think. I just started moving. Not running this time, just walking fast, pushing forward, trying to keep my breathing steady. I kept the flashlight low, watched the ground, didn't look back. I don't know how long I walked. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The fear started to fade into exhaustion. My legs hurt, my throat was dry, my hands were shaking. And then, through the trees, I saw something. A light. Faint. Flickering. My campfire. Relief hit me so hard I almost fell to my knees. I stumbled toward it, breaking through the tree line, finally stepping back into my campsite. The fire had burned low, just embers now, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel safe again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, watching the trees, listening to every sound. By morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. My own paranoia. Maybe I had seen another hiker. Maybe my mind had played a trick on me in the dark. But when I packed up my gear and started to leave, I saw something just beyond the edge of my camp. A single footprint in the dirt. Not mine. I left and never went back. When I was 14, I went to this outdoor education boarding school tucked away in the Victorian Alps in Australia. The school was situated in one of those rugged, wild parts of the country where the air is thick with the scent of pine, the mountains rise sharp and heavy, and the fog often lingers in the valleys like a bad memory. The kind of place where every weekend we'd set off on hikes through the thick bushland, the kind that pushed you to your physical limits and tested your mental ones. We'd do hikes that lasted anywhere from 2 to 3 days, sometimes even longer, and though the trek was usually exhausting, the sense of accomplishment when we completed each hike kept me coming back. At the time, we all knew the stories the teachers and locals would tell about hermits living out in those mountains. It seemed like the sort of thing adults say to make kids feel nervous or scared. But over time, the idea of some old hermit in the wild became almost a joke between my friends and I. There was no way people actually lived out there alone, in the middle of nowhere. Or so I thought. One of those hikes, though, changed my perspective entirely. It was the end of winter, that time when everything feels like it's on the cusp of something new, but still weighed down by the last breath of the cold season. We were about halfway through a 4-day hike, the second day, to be precise. The fog hung thick around us, clinging to the landscape like a blanket, so dense that you could barely make out the shape of the person walking in front of you. The air was damp and freezing, and despite the layers of clothes we wore, it felt like the cold just wouldn't leave us. The terrain was steep, the ridge sharp, and we were hiking in silence. Not that there was much to say. When you're trudging up a mountainside in those conditions, conversation doesn't come easy. You just keep moving forward, head down, focused on each step. That's when I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, a shape, dark and moving through the fog. It was about 50 meters down the side of the ridge. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but as I squinted, I saw it more clearly. A black dog, sleek and well-defined, trotting along the edge of the ridge. It didn't look like a dingo. This was something else, jet black and wearing a collar. I paused, unsure of what I was seeing, but the moment passed quickly, and I kept walking. Then, just as I turned my head back to focus on the trail in front of me, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't just the dog. There was a man behind the dog, walking through the trees. The fog made it hard to tell if he was even real or just an illusion, but his shape was clear. He was dressed in ragged clothes, a silhouette against the mist, looking up at us. I froze for a second, caught between disbelief and confusion. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories of hermits or loners living up in these mountains, but this felt real. There was something about the way he moved, darting in and out of trees, as though he was trying to remain hidden. It wasn't just a passing figure. I could feel the oddity of the moment deep in my bones. I turned to my mate, pointing down the slope. I told him what I saw. There was a man with a dog down there, just below us. He looked and immediately saw the same thing I had. His face went pale for a moment, and I could tell that he was just as confused and unsettled as I was. We told the others, but by the time they all stopped and looked down the slope, The man and his dog were gone. The mist had swallowed them up. Some of the guys laughed it off, brushing it off as nothing more than a day hiker and his dog. Probably a hermit, one of them joked. But we didn't talk about it much more after that. There was an unsettling feeling in the air that didn't sit right with me, but I didn't voice it. We kept moving. We reached the Vallejo Gartner hut later that evening. It was a place I'd been to many times before. It had that unmistakable charm, rustic, cold, and covered in graffiti, names scratched into the wooden walls from years of hikers who had passed through. The atmosphere felt familiar and somewhat comforting, like an old, worn-in pair of boots. But tonight, that comfort felt distant. We weren't allowed to stay in the hut because of school rules, so we set up camp around it. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the fog thickened, and the cold really started to bite. There wasn't much to do other than cook dinner, sit around, and talk about the day's hike. I tried to push the image of the man and his dog out of my head, but the sight of him kept creeping back into my mind. It was almost dark when nature called. I decided to head to the toilet, which was perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the valley below. As I sat there, I tried to distract myself from the uneasy feeling in my gut by taking in the view. But something wasn't right. There was an eerie quiet that hung in the air. Then I saw it. Words, hastily scrawled on the walls of the toilet. It was a mess of scribbled notes and names, the typical stuff you'd see in places like that. But this one stood out. Written in big, messy letters were the words, "Run, run, run. He's coming. Run." My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't focus on anything else. The cold air felt like it was closing in on me, and for the first time, I realized how alone I was. I bolted out of the bathroom, heart racing, and scrambled back to my tent. I told the guy I was sharing with what I saw. He had seen the same man earlier in the day, and now the two of us were both unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night dragged on. We lay in our tents, hardly making a sound, both of us wide awake. The wind howled outside, the cold pressing against the walls of the tent, but it wasn't the weather that kept me up. It was the thought of that man, wandering through the fog, and the creepy words I had seen in the bathroom. We didn't sleep much that night. The next morning was worse. We woke up to find that a large portion of our food was missing. The bags we had kept outside our tents were torn open, and our food, snacks, dried meals was gone. At first, we thought it was a wombat or some other animal, but the packs had been opened. Zippers had been undone. There was no way an animal could have done that. It hit me then. The man, the hermit I saw the day before. I was sure now. He had followed us to our campsite, maybe watching us from the trees while we slept, and stole our food. It was the only explanation that made sense. He wasn't a hiker or a lost tourist. He was someone who knew these mountains, who lived in the wild, and wasn't interested in being found. We packed up as quickly as we could, trying to stay calm. No one spoke much. The whole mood of the group had shifted. We finished the hike, though it felt like we were being watched the whole time. Every rustle in the trees, every shift in the fog made us jump. We got back to the school, and I didn't tell anyone else what I'd seen. Part of me wondered if they'd believe me, or if they'd think I was just spooked by the stories. But I knew what I saw. The hermit wasn't just a ghost story or some local myth. He was out there, living in the fog, hidden from the world. And that feeling, the one that told me I wasn't alone, stayed with me long after we left the mountains. That hike was the last time I went out there with the school. The mountains held a different kind of weight for me after that. I didn't go back. Not out of fear, but because I had seen the truth, the wild, the unknown, the people who live out there. Those are the things that stay hidden, in the fog, in the corners of the world where no one else looks. It was 4 a.m. on a warm July night in Missouri. The kind of night where the air is thick with humidity, but it doesn't really feel oppressive. More like that heavy, calm quiet that takes over before dawn. I was just getting back to my apartment from a long day of work, and my dog, Lucy, was acting up as usual. She was a rescue, and despite having been with me for 6 months, she was still terrified of just about everything. The sight of someone walking by too quickly would make her tuck her tail and look for a place to hide. Her anxiety had made it hard for us to do much of anything, but I'd grown accustomed to her behavior. Tonight, though, she was worse than usual. She kept whining and pacing at the door, unable to settle. I figured she probably needed to go to the bathroom, so I reluctantly put on my shoes and grabbed her leash. I didn't want to take her out. Not this late, not when the world felt so still and dark. but we didn't have much choice. She needed to go, and I wasn't going to let her just do her business in the apartment. The complex was quiet as usual. Most people were probably still asleep, their windows shut tight. I could hear the faint hum of the AC units in the distance, but nothing else. No traffic, no people. Just the sound of my footsteps on the concrete and the soft scrape of Lucy's claws against the pavement as she pulled ahead of me. We walked down the street, and the further we got from the apartment complex, the eerier it felt. It wasn't just that it was early or that it was dark. It was the kind of night where every creak and groan of the world feels louder. The kind of quiet where your mind starts to play tricks on you. I had almost gotten used to the calm when I saw him. There was a figure standing under the streetlight at the intersection up ahead. At first, I thought it was just another jogger out for an early run, which wasn't unusual for this part of the city. But as I got closer, I noticed that the figure wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just standing there for some reason I didn't understand. I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to get close enough to find out. I kept walking, Lucy pulling on the leash as she sniffed the air, a little more restless than usual. Then the figure started to move. It wasn't jogging. It wasn't walking. It was something different. He was skipping in a way that didn't make any sense. His legs seemed to jerk with each movement, his arms flailing slightly as he propelled himself toward me. There was no rhythm to it, no natural flow to his movements, just this sudden, erratic skipping. Almost like he was trying to make himself look harmless, or like he wasn't really moving at all. My heart rate spiked. I stopped walking and stood there for a second, watching as the man closed the distance between us. I was trying to process what was going on. Was he drunk? Hi. Something else entirely? My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation for why this man was moving so oddly, why he looked like he had no care in the world while I felt my skin crawl. Lucy's growl broke me out of my thoughts. I hadn't heard her growl before. She wasn't an aggressive dog, not by nature. But the sound was unmistakable, a low, deep growl that rumbled from her chest. I turned around, startled. She was standing behind me, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the figure. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I started to walk quickly, back towards the apartment complex. The streetlight above me flickered as I walked, casting long, erratic shadows on the pavement. I glanced over my shoulder, and the man was still skipping toward me, faster now, the rhythm of his movements somehow unsettling. He wasn't running. He wasn't even walking. He was skipping, with that same strange, jerky motion. I felt my stomach drop. My instincts told me to hurry, to get to safety. Lucy was pulling on her leash, more frantic now, sensing something I couldn't see. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but I knew I needed to get away from that man. I picked up my pace, looking behind me again. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. Or maybe I thought I could convince myself it was all just some weird, late-night mistake. But when I looked back, the man wasn't where I had last seen him. He wasn't further down the street. No, he was standing at the entrance to my apartment complex. And he was smiling. The grin on his face wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't the kind of expression someone wears when they're having a good time. No, this smile stretched unnaturally wide, like he was trying too hard. His teeth were visible in the dim light, and it looked like they might have been a little too sharp. His eyes weren't wide with excitement either. They were narrow, almost predatory. But it wasn't just the look on his face that bothered me. It was the fact that he was standing perfectly still, like he had been there the whole time, just watching us. I didn't waste any more time looking at him. I broke into a quick walk, then a jog, heading straight for my building. My heart was hammering in my chest, and Lucy's growling had turned into frantic barking now. She had never done that before. She was so scared. I was scared, too. I glanced over my shoulder again, just to make sure the man wasn't moving. But when I looked, he was gone. He had disappeared into the shadows, like he had never been there at all. I wasn't sure whether that was better or worse. I turned the corner into the complex, and for a moment, everything seemed to be fine. The gates were closed, the area was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. But the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the weirdness of the situation that bothered me. It was the fact that I had no idea who that man was, or what he wanted. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I reached my building and unlocked the door as fast as I could, pushing Lucy inside before I stepped in myself. I checked the locks, then the deadbolt, just to make sure everything was secure. And then I sat there for a moment, my breathing slowing, my hands still shaking. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just some guy being weird at an odd hour of the night. But I couldn't convince myself. The next day, I spoke to my landlord. I wasn't sure why I did, but I had to say something. I told her what happened, about the man skipping and the grin, about how he seemed to appear and disappear like he was playing some game. She looked at me like she had heard this story before. They've had multiple reports of that same man in the complex, she said. People have seen him skipping around late at night, and whenever the police show up, he's gone. No one knows where he goes. No one knows who he is. But I don't think you're the first one to see him. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't tell Lucy's story about how she had growled. I didn't tell her about the feeling that had never gone away, the feeling that something wasn't right. I just nodded and thanked her for the information. But that wasn't the end of it. I couldn't shake the thought of that man, of his skipping, and of that disturbing grin. It was as if he had been waiting for me, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't explain why, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just a random encounter. There was something wrong about that night, something that didn't add up. And no matter how many times I walked around the apartment complex after that, no matter how many times I told myself I was being paranoid, I never saw him again. But every time the sun went down and the night crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone.